Chapter 13, Experimental Design and Analysis of Variance. In this chapter, we're going to look at three different approaches to testing hypotheses about population means for three or more populations. Chapter 10 dealt with two population means. So here we are extending it to more than two, three or more populations. So basic notations we use are mu sub j is the mean of population j going from 1 through k populations. And similarly, sigma squared sub j is the variance of each of those k populations. Now let's look at some examples of three or more populations. So suppose we want to see whether there is any difference in the starting salaries for different college majors. So each major will be a population. So there are, for example, 10 or 15 majors, and in each major we have graduates, and then see whether the starting salaries for each of those different majors are same or are they different. So that's one example. Another example, suppose if there is a dairy farmer who is considering like 3 or 4 or 5 so different feed regimen for their milk cows, and they want to see whether the yield will be different among these different feed regimens. So each feed regimen will be one population. So feed regimen 1 is the first population, feed regimen 2 is the second population, and so on. And you feed these or you apply these feed regimens to a sample of cows and study whether the yield will be same or not. So that is another example. So another example, if you have different reading projects or programs, reading programs, and you want to see whether the effectiveness of the reading program in school children, whether it improves the reading skills or not, or are there any differences among these different reading programs in terms of the effectiveness in improving reading skills for school children. So you can study that in this kind of an analysis, which is called analysis of variance. Okay, now let's look at some concepts and terminologies. So in this environment, we have what are called factor, treatments, and response variable, experimental unit, and so on. So let's take the first item, factor. Factor is the variable that differentiates different populations. For example, in the previous example that we looked at, so we have different reading programs. So each reading program defines one population. So reading programs is your factor. And if you look at starting salaries of majors, then major is the factor that differentiates different populations. And treatments is the different levels within those factors. So if major is the factor, then each major, so management, marketing, engineering, and so on. So those are the treatments, and they are also called treatment levels of the factor. Categories within the factor, so that's called treatment. The response variable is what we measure from these different treatment levels. For example, in the case of starting salaries in different majors, within each major you're going to measure the starting salary. So starting salary then becomes the response variable. In the case of reading skills example, then the test score becomes our response variable. In the case of milk cows, then milk yield is your response variable. Now, experimental unit is the subject from which the response variable is measured. So in the case of starting salaries, it will be the graduates. In the case of milk yield, it is the cows. In the case of reading skills, then it will be the elementary school children or students. Now, observational study and experimental study. So, in analysis of variance, you can apply the, or you can gather sample data in two different ways. One is called observational study, where you do not actively assign experimental units to different treatment levels. Okay, they exist already, and then you go and take measurements. In experimental study, you carefully assign the experimental units to different levels of the treatment, and that makes it an experimental study. In observational study, the final results that we obtain can only be used as a possible association between the treatment levels and the response variable. But in the case of experimental study, cause and effect relationship can be established. So experimental studies do give a more concrete or more valuable result, but it also means that you have to carefully design the experiment and implement it. So it takes more time and effort and money to do an experimental study, and the benefit is that you can arrive at very strong conclusions. Okay. Randomization is the process by which you assign experimental units to the treatment levels in an experimental study. So the examples that we just went over, so the first example, starting salary of business majors, the major is the factor, and the different treatment levels are the majors that are considered, and response variable is the starting salary. The experimental unit is graduates, and type of study here is observational because the experimenter is not the one who is assigning the students to different majors. Students make that choice, so you have to observe choices that are already made independent of the person who is doing the study. Second example is the feed example, where feed is the factor, and there are 4 feeds, for example. Let's assume that there are 4 different feeds, feed regimens. The response variable is milk yield, and experimental unit is the cows. Now here we could set this up as an experimental study, like you can randomly select cows and assign the cows to different feed regimens. So this could be carefully set up as an experimental study. That was not possible in the case of starting salaries because there is no way that we can force students into a particular major. So it can only be an observational study in the case of starting salaries, whereas example 2, it could be an experimental study as well. Now example 3 is the reading program example. And suppose there are 3 reading programs that we are considering. So they are the treatment levels, and test score is your response variable, and the experimental unit are the students who are participating in this study. Now, this also can be set up as an experimental study because the students can be randomly assigned to the different reading programs. So this could be an experimental study as well.